Yo guys, what is up? It is Alex or Black Eye here. Two things before going on to the patch notes. One, I was nominated for Community Member of the Year in Hi-Rez's Golden Bolts, and I'd really appreciate your vote. Link is in the description to vote, and thanks again. Secondly, they changed the format of the patch notes specifically for how gods and items were buffed or nerfed, so due to that these videos will be formatted a little bit differently, but I will still go over everything that changed. But that being said, here is the SMITE 9.11 patch notes in 12 minutes. Without further ado, let's get started. Starting off with the skins, we are going to firstly go over the RuneScape crossover skins, and then I will go into the RuneScape crossover event afterwards. First off, we have Gnome Child Vamana, Rune Armor Bologna, King Black Dragon Cerberus, Wise Old Man Merlin, and finally, Blessed Dragonhide Neath. Finally, they have finished the last SWC World Championship skin with Atlantis Leviathan's Gilgamesh. The other skins include Dragon Lord Lancelot, Midnight Waters Yamoja, Shining Dragon Yu Huang, Tokyo Knight Ares, Spectral Oni Kleena, Mecha Empress Hera, Rogue Cyborg Izanami, Devilish Charm Baron Samdi, Magusa Medusa, and Neon Pulse Freya. 2 weeks later, during the bonus update, they're adding on to the Mami line of skins by giving us Heatwave Pele. And we are also getting Winged Machina Nike and Bit Fortune Ganesh. As I said earlier, there are 5 different RuneScape themed skins available for purchase, but there will also be a variety of capes that you can put on any of the RuneScape skins. Although, you need to unlock these capes one by one by doing quests that they've implemented for each cape. An example of some of these quests are on screen now. 9.11 will also feature a new battle pass, the Cyber Tokyo Battle Pass, which will be available for 600 gems, or the plus version of the battle pass for 1200 gems. I normally don't talk about Smite Night during these updates, but for week 1 we are seeing the return of Domination, which has undergone some improvements. These improvements include a new map layout and increased starting XP and gold. The new map will consist of portal gods, slash NPCs for buff camps, and sand guardians. The only quality of life update we are getting is more god avatars. As always when it comes to bug fixes, I just read through it and highlighted what I believe were the most important bug fixes. Firstly, they fixed an issue where gods could use abilities while Aegis was activated. On Yamoja, they fixed an issue where her ultimate could move Apophis and slash. With Fafnir, they fixed an issue where he could leap during his ultimate transformation. With Persephone, they fixed an issue where she could cast abilities while in her passive state, so think old Persephone passive. And with Manticores, they fixed the spike drop inconsistencies for multiple god abilities. There is also a plethora of Maui fixes, most notably where they fix an issue where his first ability would sometimes just not pull people even if you hit them. Moving on to game mode changes, there will be a soft reset in all ranked game modes, which means players in Masters and Grandmasters will be reset to Diamond 1 and 2750 MMR. There will be no changes made to players at lower ranks and no changes made to the god leaderboards. For Duel and Joust, these modes will now be essentially just swapping their maps. Duel will now take place on the Chinese Joust map from Season 3, and Joust and Ranked Joust will now take place on the Jade Corruption map from Season 7. It's also worth noting that Duel will still have starter items disabled, and the maps have had their map NPCs and rules adjusted to match the intended mode. For Arena, the Arena environment art has been changed to Cthulhu's Arena. And for Conquest, we're seeing 2 changes. First, they extended the Invader's Curse to go deeper into both jungles. And finally, Red Buff will see a decrease in max health and magical protections, essentially making it easier to kill. If you are watching this, there's a pretty good chance you aren't subscribed. If you enjoy educational and entertaining Smite content, then I'd appreciate your subscription. Even if you don't, thank you for making it this far into the video. Okay, back to the patch notes. Moving on to game balance. As I said earlier, they have reformatted this to show what goals they'd like to achieve. So instead of going by gods and items like I've done in previous videos, we're just going to follow the format that's on the patch notes. The first section is Mage early game shifts. Starting with Bancroft's Claw, the shield size is being decreased by 0.25%. Sands of Time is getting the true damage on minions increased by 5. Vamp Shroud is getting a sort of rework. Its magical power is being increased by 10. The 5 physical protections and 75 health have been removed, They added 7 MP5 and increased the magical lifesteal from 5% to 7%. This also affects Sacrificial Shroud, where its new stats are 115 magical power, 15% magical lifesteal, increased physical protections from 20 to 40, they removed the 100 health and added 15 MP5. And finally, this affects Blood-Soaked Shroud, where the magical power is being increased from 75 to 95, they removed the 55 physical protections, they increased the health from 200 to 300, it'll have 15% magical lifesteal, and they added 15 MP5. Soul Gem is getting a buff, where the amount of stacks required to trigger the passive is going down by 1. Chronos Pennant is getting a decrease in cost by 100. Agni is getting more base damage on his second ability and ultimate ability. Anubis is getting a pretty big cooldown increase on his first ability, where it is now 11 seconds at all ranks. Discordia is getting 10 more base damage to her first ability. The range of Hera's first ability is being increased by 5 units, and the base HP of her third ability is getting increased. Nuwa's first ability is seeing a 2-second cooldown reduction. Scylla's second ability will have lane minions and jungle camps take an extra 20% damage. And Zeus is getting a base damage increase on both his first ability and his third ability. And finally, the Morrigan is getting multiple abilities nerfed. Her first ability is getting a decrease in damage to minions by 15% and a decrease in magical power scaling by 10%. Her second ability is seeing a decrease in initial base damage, bonus minion base damage, and bonus god base damage by 5 at all ranks. And finally, her ultimate ability is seeing an increase in cooldown that is scaled towards the late game. The second section of the balance updates are late game burst damage nerfs, starting with Titan's Bane, which is seeing an increase in cost by 50 and a decrease in physical power by 5. Obsidian Shard is also seeing an increase in cost by 50 and a decrease in magical power by 10. And finally, Staff of Mirrodin is getting a decrease in the damage buff from the item's passive by 5%. The next section is Mid-Hunter nerfs, where we're seeing the Crusher lose 5 physical power, and we're also seeing some Amu's and Cobb nerfs. His second ability is seeing a decrease in base damage, and his ultimate ability is seeing a decrease in cooldown reduction on retrieving the Stinger from 80% to 60%. The next section consists of warrior solo buffs. Starting with Warding Sigil, we're seeing an increase in magical protection by 5. Berserker Shield is seeing an increase in physical protection by 10, and an increase in damage mitigation from the item's passive by 3%. Mystical Mail is seeing an increase in health by 50, and an increase in physical protection by 5. Runic Shield is seeing an increase in the magical power debuff aura by 10. The Sledge is seeing an increase in physical power by 5 and an increase in physical protections per stack from its passive by 2. This only affects the physical protections and will not affect the magical protections, which will remain at 8 per stack. Thorns of the Overgrowth is getting buffed, where we're seeing an increase in the reflect damage by 10%, and we're seeing an increase in the maximum damage reflected. Thorns of Sapping Strength is also getting a buff, where we're seeing an increase in the lifesteal debuff on enemies by 25%, and an increase in the maximum damage reflected. Hades is seeing a shift that's more of like a nerf, but on his third ability, Devour Souls, the detonate portion of this ability will see a decrease in base damage for the first 4 ranks and a very slight increase in base damage on the final rank. Moving on to Gilgamesh, his first ability will now give him HP 5 while this ability is active, and his second ability is getting a decrease in cooldown by 2 seconds. For Sun Wukong, the physical and magical protections that Sun Wukong gains from his passive is being increased by 1 per level. And finally, on his second ability, the duration of the slow and attack speed slow will be increased by 1 second. Now moving on to support buffs. Drowned Ankh is seeing an increase in the healing debuff by 20%. Bracer of Illumination is seeing a 5% increase in power when above half health, and a 5% increase in movement speed when below half health. Cloak of the Avatar is seeing an increase in health and mana restoration on each pulse. On Scorching Blink, the duration of the damage over time after leaving the area is being increased by 0.5. Emblem of Trembling Terror is getting a buff where they're decreasing the threshold to trigger the tremble by 5% of the target's max HP and increasing the duration of the tremble by 1.5 seconds. Both Hastened Wings and Entangling Wings is getting a movement speed buff by 5%. Sundering Siphon is getting a buff where the duration of the effect is being decreased by 1 second, but the percent current health damage per tick is being increased by 3%. This increases the total damage by 4% and happens faster. Spirit Robe is getting a cost decrease by 100 gold. The number of stacks to finish Gauntlet of Thieves is being increased by 5, which is essentially just increasing its physical and magical protections by 5. Sylvanas is seeing a buff where the cooldown reduction on his passive is now increasing to 1 second at level 15 instead of level 17. And on Sylvanas' first ability, we're seeing a decrease in cooldown by 1 second at all ranks. Finally, the cooldown of Jingchen's second ability is being decreased by 2 seconds. Moving on to duo lane hunter buffs. Gilded Arrow is getting a buff where killing your marked target gives you 5% more attack speed and 10 more mana than it used to. This attack speed buff also applies to Diamond Arrow. Griffin Wing Earrings is seeing an increase in physical power by 5, an increase in magical power by 10, and an increase in attack speed by 5%. Kronos is getting a few buffs. On his second ability, the attack speed is being increased in the early levels, but staying the same towards the later levels. And the magical power he gains from the third section of his second ability is being increased by 10%. Finally, they're decreasing the base damage of his third ability scaled towards the later ranks. Danzaboro is seeing some buff, where the physical power he gains per pouch from his passive is being increased by 4. Since there are 4 pouches, this increases the total physical power gained from his passive by 16. And finally, his first ability is seeing an increase in base damage by 15 at all ranks. For Hachiman, his first ability is seeing a basic attack power scaling increase by 10% at all ranks, and the duration of his second ability is being increased to 6 seconds at all ranks. For Ishtar, her third ability now gains some additional immunity frames after hitting an enemy god. Moving on to basic attack assassin buffs, the only thing here is Serrated Edge, which is seeing a decrease in cost by 150 and an increase in physical lifesteal by 5%. And finally, the last section is general underperformers, which consists of Bastet, where her second ability is getting an increased dot damage physical power scaling by 5% per tick. And finally, Kleina's second ability is seeing an increase in physical power scaling. And that's all for the patch notes. Thank you guys for watching. This has been Black Eye, and I'll see you in the next video.